Welcome back, everybody. Nick, who was our guest today?
Our guest was Dr. Dan Conroy-Beam. He's an assistant professor at UCSB, and he is in the field of evolutionary psychology. Brendan, can you tell us a little bit more about some of his research interests?
Yeah, he runs the Computational Mate Choice Lab at UCSB. He specifically studies mate choice and how he can potentially create models to predict mate choice. It's really fascinating stuff. They're looking at people's preferences and mate selection criteria, and they're trying to run predictive models on how to do it. So it's totally like his area of expertise. He's definitely like clearly brilliant in this topic.
Yeah.
So it's really cool to hear him talk about how the research has been getting done in this area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so in this episode, we discuss his journey through grad school, his experience as a professor running a research lab, his research interests, including mate choice, and then also just some advice he has for people who are potentially interested in a PhD program, which was really interesting as well. So stay tuned for that.
And also, we talk about birds, which is pretty interesting too. So I hope you guys enjoy it.
Yeah. Hope you enjoy. Sit back, relax.
Peace.
Peace.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. Dr. Conroy-Beam, thank you for joining us today. We're really appreciative. The way we like to start is by having you do a little background on how you got into the work you're doing and a little bit of the origin story behind what led you to that work. So if you wouldn't mind giving us and everybody else a little intro, we'd greatly appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I came to the work I do in a pretty roundabout way, I guess. I think that's a pretty common thing, especially for people who work in my field. I mean, I had always been interested in the natural world. I think, growing up as a kid, I was always super interested in animals. I had like tons of pets because my parents indulged me way too much. And I just always had like a fascination with sort of the diversity of life. But I never really knew like what sort of career that would translate into. So for most of my life, I had no idea what I wanted to do. So that, basically ended up with me going into college kind of vaguely thinking I wanted to be a doctor because I enjoyed biology and that was a career that involved biology that I knew made money. So that was, my vague plan initially. And I got to college and my first semester, I just had to take some classes and I had to take some electives, and I took a psychology class as an elective, and I thought, this is going to be awful. I have no interest in this whatsoever. This is going to be like so, silly and unscientific, but I'll just like get it out of the way and it'll count for one of my electives. And the guy who taught it, it was Intro to Psych. The guy who taught it just happened to be an evolutionary psychologist. And he, maybe somewhat unethically, don't know if you'll watch this, DL, but maybe somewhat unethically sort of taught the class as though it was an evolutionary psychology class and just, approached this like, if we wanted to use an evolutionary approach to understand the mind, what would we do? And I just found that mind-blowing. I had never known before that point that you could do psychology as a science. I thought of psychology as like, laying people down on sofas and just sort of telling stories about their lives. So the idea that you could like approach the human mind scientifically was new to me. And the idea that you could apply evolutionary theory to understand behavior at all was new to me. That you could do it to understand human behavior was new to me. And it just seemed so exciting and elegant. And I was like immediately enthralled. And thankfully he noticed that because I, would have had no idea what to do with that interest. But he saw that I was really vibing with it. And he asked if I wanted to get involved in research. I started helping him out with research, and one thing led to another, and now I'm here. And that was how I got into evolutionary psychology. How I got into mating was also just sort of like, once I made the connection, you can use evolutionary theory to study behavior. I think mating was sort of a natural first choice. I think it is a natural first choice for a lot of people who do evolution and human behavior work. Evolution is just differential reproduction. And so if you want to understand how evolution has impacted the mind, what better place to start than how people mate? And so I got interested in mating work, and it's continued through now.
Yeah, that's it's so interesting just to hear about how like one class can really spark a whole interest in a career.
Yeah, I'm slightly horrified what would have happened if I took any other elective. There are a lot of decision points on this path where I could have gone in a very different direction.
Yeah, I'm curious about, like, before we move into a lot of the research that you do, like what your experience was like in grad school. I guess what maybe some mentorship was like, and what kind of role that might have played, and how it's kind of steered you into the work that you do today.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, mentorship has been, as my story maybe already reveals, I mean, it's been really pivotal to my entire research trajectory. And I was also, super fortunate. I was doing my undergrad at the University of Texas, which just happens to be, one of the sort of historic strongholds for doing evolutionary psychology, and happens to be who would ultimately become my advisor, David Buss works, and David Buss is a very big name in human mating research. And so, it was David Lewis who sort of initially fostered my interest in evolutionary psychology, and really, as an undergraduate, kind of stoked that flame in me, and gave me lots of really invaluable experience that set me on this path. And then once I got into graduate school, evolutionary psychology, it's a pretty small field. It's growing, but it's still quite small. And for most of the time, pretty much all the time I was in grad school, I mean, there were 2 evolutionary psychologists in my program. So, if I wanted to talk about evolution and behavior stuff, I, basically can only talk to them or their students, which is unfortunate, right? I think there are pros and cons. The cons are it's a small community, but the pros are, you get to know each other very well, right? And those relationships become very important. And so, yeah, I think having that sort of close mentoring relationship with my advisor was also pretty instrumental to developing me as a scientist.
Yeah. And so what were some of kind of the early interests that you had in, like, mate preference and mate selection?
Oh man, I have drifted so far. My early interests were terrible. I just had, I was interested in just the worst ideas for a very long time. It took me a long time to come up with any ideas worth pursuing. Initially I was sort of more interested in, there are 2 big topics that I was initially interested in. One was hormones, just because around the time that I was getting interested in human mating psychology was sort of the peak days of research on ovulation. There's a lot of research coming out around that time on ways in which mating behavior changes across the menstrual cycle, and that really captivated me. In part because it was something that seemed hard to explain except by an evolutionary perspective, right? This is like a domain of research that really, evolutionary psychologists had a monopoly on, and so that partly motivated me to do more of that work. Although I wasn't really trained in it, and my lab wasn't really set up for it, so that was sort of doomed from the start. And I was also really interested in basically learning, the role of learning in mating, which is something that proved harder to study than I initially anticipated. So I kind of gave up on it, and have given up on it for a long time, although some of that might start to come back in the next few years. We'll see. I didn't drift into, mate preferences and mate choice until, year 3 or 4 of grad school, is when I started doing that work. And it was, again, total serendipity, the way I got there. There's multiple threads to the story. To keep it short, I'll give just one for now. But there were some prominent papers. Mate preferences is a huge area of research in human mating and evolutionary psychology and social psychology. There's decades and decades and thousands of papers published on what people want in a partner, right? But the overwhelming majority of that research is just what do people want, right? There's not a lot of research on where do those desires come from. There's not a lot of research on what do those desires do. There's just a lot of work on what are the nature, what are those desires. And so there were a few prominent papers that had come out of people criticizing this work, I think fairly, but also trying to claim that basically mate preferences don't guide real behavior, that people's preferences don't have any role in what they do. And that just seemed extremely implausible to me. It seems so unlikely that everywhere around the world people would express these preferences in this systematic way, in ways that perfectly line up with what we know about evolutionary theory, but then those preferences would have no connection to behavior. That just seemed deeply implausible. And it also seemed to me that there were, compelling alternative explanations for why it might seem like preferences are not very effectual. And so I, sort of mused those ideas with my advisor, and he was like, "Oh, those are good points. You should explore that more." And I kind of put together a few little projects just to satisfy myself, just to see, like, do these ideas seem like they work in principle? And people were like, "Oh, this is interesting. You should do more of this." And one thing led to another, and now I study mate choice, even though that was not what I was initially interested in.
What was one of those first projects that you felt like was kind of a Kickstarter to really travel down this path?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, without naming names, there were some people who, and this is, I think, actually like a good position, right? I think this is like a very reasonable argument to have made, and I think it's been very good for the field that they made this argument, even if I think in the end that it's wrong. But basically, there are some people who've argued that people don't really know what they want in a partner, and/or people's preferences aren't really that connected to their behavior. Sorry, the dogs are going to walk around behind me. People have argued that preferences aren't really important to real mate choice behavior, in part on the basis of some evidence that if you look in, for example, like speed dating studies, right, where you get a bunch of people together to do a speed date, you ask them beforehand, what do you want in a partner, and then you look afterwards who they actually picked, and you see how well can I predict who they picked on the basis of what they said they wanted. And basically what you see is there's not a super strong correlation between what people say they want and who they actually choose. That's summarizing a lot of research a little bit glibly, but that's basically the main takeaway. And so several people have argued on that basis that maybe preferences don't really matter that much to choice. And my thought was, okay, I mean, that's possible, but also the system is way more complicated, right? This is not like, you don't just like go to the grocery store and buy a partner off the shelf, right? There's a lot of things going on when you're choosing a partner, right? You have to consider, who's around. You have to pick among the people that are available to you, and the people that you want might not necessarily be around. You have to consider who you're competing with, and who might swoop in and get your preferred partner before you want to. And you have to balance your desires with what they want, right? The person you like the most might not like you back. So there's lots of constraints going on here that limit your ability to pursue who you actually might want to pursue. And if you consider all of those other constraints, then what you might see is that people try to act on their preferences, but they fail in various ways because of all these other constraints. And so that was the idea in my head. But I wanted to show, like, in principle, this could actually explain the pattern of results that people see. If you, set up a theoretical world where you incorporated those constraints, you would see data that is much like what we see in the real world. And I had, a little bit of programming experience from a couple of classes that I just happened to take by chance. And so I was like, I could probably make a world where that's true. And I could see, does that world look like the real world? So I just, in a few afternoons or something like that, just kind of hacked together a crummy little simulation that was, a bunch of little simulated people who had little simulated preferences and tried to choose each other as partners, but were subject to all these constraints that we know happen in the real world, and try to see, how good of a job do these little simulated people do at actually fulfilling our preferences. And the answer was kind of poorly, right? Even when they actually try, because of these constraints, their preferences don't necessarily correlate all that strongly with their actual choices. And that was, one of the first projects on mate choice, one of the first projects incorporating computer simulations, just to make the point that when you consider all of the things that are going on in a realistic mating market, you do see data that looks a lot like what people were finding in these real mate choice studies.
What were some of those constraints that you implemented in like the first model?
Sure. So in the first model, I mean, there's issues of availability, right? Your perfect partner is not necessarily around, so you've got to make some compromises, you've got to make some trade-offs. So that's going to limit your ability to fulfill your preferences, right? If you want somebody who's a 10 out of 10 on physical attractiveness, but the most attractive person around is an 8 out of 10, right? Like you got to make do.
Yeah.
Another is, competition, right? Like, you can want a 10 out of 10 all you want, but if you're a 2 out of 10, right, like that's probably not going to work out. I guess that's more of a mutual attraction sort of constraint. The competition constraint is more, if you're an 8 out of 10, but somebody else is a 10 out of 10 and they want your partner, right, they're probably going to get them before you do. So, those are the big three: availability, competition, and mutual attraction, right? If you incorporate those, which are, inevitable aspects of any kind of mating market, any kind of realistic mating market, then you see, people try and they get pretty close to what they want for the most part overall. But, you can't always get what you want.
Are there like general traits or characteristics that people do like that the research has found?
Yeah, I mean, there's pretty, a pretty reliable pattern when you just ask people, right? What does your ideal romantic partner look like? People pretty much around the world say more or less the same thing, which is, everybody towards the top of everybody's list is always things like kindness, intelligence, humor, good health. These are things that are pretty universally desired in a romantic partner. And then there are some pretty robust universal gender differences as well. So men on average more than women. So those are the things that are always towards the top of everybody's list. And then after that, you start to see the things that are more gender differentiated. So, for men, the next highest thing that comes up more often than for women is something like things like physical attractiveness. For women, more often than men, it's things like good financial prospects. Men on average tend to prefer partners who are a little bit younger than themselves. Women on average tend to prefer partners that are a little bit older than themselves. Those are, pretty well established through, multiple decades of large scale cross-cultural experiments. Those are the things that people tend to desire the most.
Yeah, and it lines up with what Dr. Jamie Krems was telling us about how women are looking for resources because they would need them to take care of their children, and men are looking for top of the status. They want to get to the top of the food chain in that sense too. So from an evolutionary perspective, is it safe to assume that being that the purpose, like one of the key factors of existence is to reproduce? So is the evolutionary case for studying this that it's the key motivator for the existence of the species? And so like natural selection would have selected everything else out, and therefore we're left with a bunch of like really solid habits that can then build off of the rest of evolutionary psychology from this as a core tenet. Is that pretty safe to assume?
More or less. I think a lot of my colleagues, there's two big areas of research in evolutionary psychology, right? Human mating is one super big one. And, if you look at, our journal Evolution in Human Behavior, if you look at our conference, HBS, like probably like 30% of submissions are like on mating. And then like another 30% of submissions are on like cooperation. And then the rest is like split between, a variety of other topics. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think evolutionary psychologists focus too much on mating. And so if I respond in the affirmative, all of my colleagues are going to say, oh yeah, another mating researcher saying mating is the most important thing. But I mean, yeah, like I think, like I said, okay, we want to understand human behavior. Human behavior is a product of the brain interacting with the environment. The brain is a product of genes interacting with the environment, and the genes we have exist because of our species' particular evolutionary history. And evolution is nothing more than differential reproduction of genes, right? So some genes reproduce themselves and persist, other genes don't, and they stop existing, right? So things that affect reproduction are going to exert strong selection pressures and are going to strongly shape our genes and our brains and our behavior. And what in our life is closer to reproduction than mating, right? And in particular, mate choice. So we should expect our species, just like every species, has been strongly subject to selection pressures concerning how we, conduct our affairs in the mating arena. And so we should expect a lot of adaptations in the human mind designed for navigating problems of mating. So it's sort of a natural choice, but that's not to say that mating's the only thing, right?
Right, for sure.
Yeah. There are lots of lots of things an organism needs to do in order to successfully survive and reproduce, and mating is one important link in the chain, but there's also lots of other important links in the chain. So, my cooperation colleagues, what you study is important too. I love you guys.
How much do we look at like primate mating as a model for humans, or how much do we look at it as a way to maybe differentiate how humans evolved separately and now we do things differently? Because I know that there's, I've heard a few different types of conversations where people want to draw the comparison to primates, and that's why humans must be a certain way. But I've also heard that the alternate as a strong case too. So could you maybe help us through the weeds of some of that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who you ask, right? I think if you ask my more mainstream psychological colleagues, they would say, "Oh, these evolutionary psychologists, they're too obsessed with like birds and chimps, and none of that is relevant." But if you ask my anthropologist and biologist colleagues, they would say, "Oh, these evolutionary psychologists, they don't read enough primatology, they don't read enough ornithology, they don't read enough animal behavior." So, the answer is maybe in the middle. I think evolutionary psychologists do try to draw inspiration and draw comparison to other non-human species where it's relevant, but maybe not as much as we should, because I think there is a wealth of things to learn from non-human comparisons. But at the same time, human mating is extremely unusual. We are a more or less a mildly polygynous, but still, form long-term pair bonds, which less than 5% of mammals do, and none of the other great apes. I'm going to say that out loud before I check my memory and confirm that's actually true. But none of the other great apes, form pair bonds in the way that we do. Chimps have no long-term pair bonding. Bonobos don't either. Gorillas are, extrememely have
They're all
extreme
like
harem polygyny.
A dominant hierarchy. Is that kind of how it works? And then the dominant male gets their pick of the litter, for lack of a better phrasing.
Yeah. So, non-human primates, some of them do practice pair bonding that is analogous to what we do. So, but, for the most part, especially our closest primate relatives, they're mostly, it's hard, right? In some ways, they're useful, primarily as, comparison, primarily as contrast. But there are obviously, like we share a long lineage with non-human primates, and that is going to shape the ways in which we mate in several ways. And so there's a lot to learn from understanding non-human primate mating as well. And I'm a huge bird nerd. Part of my obsession with the natural world, and there's actually a lot to learn from looking at bird mating as well, because birds are, much like humans, many birds are monogamish, right? Ostensibly pair bonding, although with some amount of polygyny and some amount of extra pair copulations, and they have life histories that are fairly human-like in lots of different ways too. So there's lots of interesting lessons we can learn from looking at bird mating as well.
Is there a very steady and sound understanding of bird mate selection? I imagine the language barrier poses quite a problem.
yeah.
But from an observational point,
there isn't, right? There's many more unanswered questions than answered questions. But avian mate choice is also a huge area of research, and it's something that a lot of evolutionary psychologists draw inspiration from as well.
What are some of the other main mammals that have monogamous relationships?
Oh, it's a good question. Off the top of my head, so the classic model organism that a lot of people study, I don't, follow too closely the non-human literature. Okay. But the main model organism that a lot of people study in terms of like non-human pair bonding and the evolution of pair bonding is prairie voles. That's like the big one that they form very secure long-term relationships that appear to have some kind of human-like attachment, or I shouldn't say human-like attachment, but some sort of attachment system which we can compare to humans in a useful way. But yeah, off the top of my head, what are other pair bonding mammals? I'm not sure. I think pair bonding is more common among primates than it is among non-primate mammals, if I'm remembering correctly. But it is, quite rare overall.
Yeah, I thought it was super interesting to hear you talk about bowerbirds and kind of their process. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could expand on that and then maybe discuss how that's like relevant to mate selection and in humans too?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I don't follow bowerbird research super closely anyway. I just always love to talk about bowerbirds. One, because I always love to cram birds into any discussion I'm having, but also two, yeah, they're just like a super evocative example of mate choice, and I think just a super great example of the power of mate choice in explaining life. So yeah, bowerbirds are these crazy little Australian birds. It's actually like a group of birds. There's several bowerbird species, but the thing that is distinctive about them, they do this. Different species do this in slightly different ways, but basically the bowerbird mating process is the males construct these like crazy elaborate little towers. I mean, you got to Google this if you haven't seen this before. They're so crazy. There's just like little shrines constructed out of mostly twigs, but also things like flowers and feathers, and they'll also like collect like colored pieces of garbage like pen caps and bottle caps and stuff like that, and feathers. And I mean, if you were like walking in the woods and you didn't know anything about birds, if you came across one of these things, you would think a human had to have constructed this, right? There's no way this came together on accident, and there's no way that like some non-human animal created this odd little structure. But no, it's birds. So the males construct these weird little shrines, and the females come and they inspect the male's shrine. They're also competitive, I should say. So the males of at least some species, if they're given the chance, they will destroy another male's bower, and they'll steal materials that they like from their bowers to bring home to their own bowers. And they do this because the females inspect the bower, and I don't even know what criteria the females are using. I don't know if it's like perfectly known exactly what criteria the females are using for these bowers, but if the females like the bower enough, then they will mate with the male. And what's extra crazy about this is the bowers are totally useless. Like, they have no utilitarian functionality. They are not nests. They do not nest in the bowers. They're purely decorative, but for whatever reason, females are really attracted to males who build good bowers, whatever a good bower is to a bowerbird. And so males have evolved this, this obsession with building these crazy little garbage towers. And it's just like, it's such a beautiful example of the importance of mating to evolution and the importance of evolution to constructing behavior, right? Like there's no account, there's no way you would ever expect these little birds who are just trying to like make it in the harsh world of nature, that they would spend so much of their precious time and energy constructing these useless little shrines, other than it gets them mating opportunities.
I mean, because as we were talking about before, my mind just jumps to like, how would a bird species like this have not like evolutionarily selected for not building that? Like, why is using energy to do that such a good I mean, it had to have, that must have been what allowed it to remain as mate choice and like procreation. I mean, I can't think of any other thing than that, but because it sounds like a colossal waste of time.
Right. Yeah. No. And this is a very common thing when you're thinking about sexual selection, right? Yeah. This is like, there's only so many hours in a day. There's only so many calories that you're going to successfully forage out of your food, and like you've got to live to tomorrow, right? And this is something that us living in our modern, industrialized, Western, well-fed lifestyles is maybe harder for us to sympathize with, because it's like, so easy to get food. We just go to the grocery store. But if you're a little bird living out in the wild, like, every day you're in danger. And so to be spending, your precious time on this stupid little shrine, like surely all else equal, a bird that did not waste its time on this, right, would survive better than a bird that was obsessed with building a weird, useless little tower. But all else isn't equal, right? Because the birds who get this get more mating opportunities. And, the ultimate currency of natural selection is reproduction in genes, right? It's no value surviving an extra 1,000 years if you don't produce any offspring. It's much better to die a day sooner if it means you produce an extra offspring. So sexual selection, and natural selection are sort of duking it out amongst one another. And the balance point in this case is, it's better to waste some of that precious time and energy building these towers if it gets you more mating opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping that possibly more about this animal. Have you done research about, or just read research about sloths and kind of their mating preference?
No, I don't know anything about sloth mating, actually.
Hash it out, Nick. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Well, Somebody's gonna have to like fact check me on this, but I was listening to a podcast about somebody who's done a lot of research with sloths, and the female sloth will sloths will just spend most of their lives in trees, and once a week, a female sloth will climb down the tree, go to the bathroom on the ground next to the tree, and will climb back up in the tree. And they do this very specifically so that males can get the scent that they're leaving and then choose the correct tree to go up. And they do this like weird call too. But yeah, they talked about how this is like such an important process, because if a male chooses the wrong tree, like they're so slow that it's like pretty like, okay, this isn't going to work. Like we're done.
Yeah. Oh, that is very interesting if true. Yeah. I mean, imagine. Yeah, mate choice is probably a pretty hard task if you're a slow moving animal that lives in trees, right? You can't just like whip out your phone and find the nearest sloth who's interested, right? You've got a 3-dimensional branch filled space that you've got to search. Having a strong scent cue as to which trees are likely to pay off is probably pretty useful.
It's so interesting. So yeah, as you started that like early computational model, you got, sounds like good feedback, and you were even more interested in, I guess, kind of how has this evolved, pun intended, and like what's the research kind of look like today, and what are some of the findings that you've had and that you still want to look at?
Yeah, so I mean, this whole research program just started as like, I thought this was going to be a side project, and it was just like some people are saying some things that sound kind of wrong, and so I'll just do like a quick little thing, just making a counterpoint, and then it just kind of kept going, right? I mean, I think the main way this developed is, I started doing that for simulation, right? And I was putting this together, and so I simulate these little agents, I give them little preferences, I give them little traits, and I get to a point where I'm like, okay, now they have to choose each other as partners. How are they going to do that, right? Like even the first step, like how does one agent know how attractive another agent is? Like how do they decide, this agent wants somebody who's funny and kind and smart, right? And they've got one partner that's, really funny, but they're kind of mean. And they got another partner that's like really smart, but they're not very funny, right? How does the agent decide which one do I like more overall? And I was like, I have no idea. I have no idea how I should program these agents to make this decision. And I can't even think of a paper in the literature that like talks about this kind of problem. Like I don't think we know how people do this. And I realized that's a problem. Somebody needs to study this. We need to figure out, how do you put together all this information on all of your different preferences and make an overall evaluation. So that became another paper. That was just like, well, what are the possibilities? Let's model a bunch of different possibilities and see, what looks most plausible. And that became, a whole stream of research that I'm still involved in on what I've ended up calling mate preference integration, right? How do you put together all of your preferences to form an overall evaluation? And, there's a handful of models from the prior literature, but not really much. And so I've been doing a lot of work on just trying to figure out how do people form those overall evaluations. And then it's also turned into, okay, if we figure out how people do that, how do you form this overall evaluation? Well, what do you do from there, right? So you've got these 20 partners, let's say, and you can rank order them in terms of how appealing they are. What do you do now? Like, who do you approach? What do you do if they say they don't like you back, right? What do you do if 2 people say they like you back, right? Like, what are the decision rules that we use to navigate those kinds of, dynamic mating markets? And again, I got there and I was like, I don't know. There's lots of different ways I can imagine this working, but I don't actually know how people do this. And again, that's a problem. So a lot of the work that we're doing now is sort of moving into that direction as well. Like, how do you, once you know how appealing you find a potential partner, how do you use that information to move throughout your mating market?
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. I mean, even just drawing the bird comparisons, I think everybody's seen kind of that bird in the Amazon, like that opens up their wings and they've got this big, beautiful display. And like, that's a signal for mating. But like, birds obviously have, or may not have, but there's a preference to find that similar species and, be drawn. But then on the other side of that, there's also a strong signal coming to like, hey, strong mate here, come on in. You know what I mean? But like humans are so much more dynamic than that. So like, I can imagine trying to figure out a way to like, just because let's say we've got 20 people, and they all exhibit the preferences that somebody may be wanting to select for, but they may not exhibit those preferences so obviously, and they may exhibit one more than the other. So then the initial interaction probably comes from, okay, this person seems the most obviously to fit that criteria, but 7 people down the line may have all the same criteria, but like, I mean, shyness could come into a factor. And how do you get how do you understand that person contains those preferences? It's got to be an incredibly difficult task to solve for.
It is. And I mean, you raise an excellent point. It's actually the paper that I'm going to start working on after I finish the paper I'm currently working on is sort of tackling exactly that kind of issue, which is we sort of take for granted, like, how do you even know? Like, okay, you want somebody who's funny. How do you even know who's funny, right? Like, how do you figure that out? Like, and it's a real, it's a challenging task, right? Because again, you've only got so much time in a day. If you want to find out if someone's funny, you've got to spend time with them. But like, 2 million people live in your city.
Yeah.
Right. Like, how are you going to find the funny ones? Maybe, you spend an hour with someone and they're not very funny. You might, write them off as not being very funny and then move on to the next day. But maybe they're just having a bad day, right? And maybe if you went back to them, they would be, riotously funny. So how do you make these kinds of decisions, these sorts of trade-off decisions where you've got a limited amount of time to find a partner and you've got to allocate that time across some set of potential partners? How do you do that in a way that optimizes both, learning what they're actually like, but also investing time in the ones that are going to turn out to be good? Because you don't want to spend, all of your time with someone and then find out, they're a sociopath, right? But you also don't want to, spread all of your time out evenly so you can, perfectly figure out what everybody is like. But then, nobody thinks you're interested in them, so they move on to other people that were more committed. So there's a kind of balancing act you have to do, and it's actually a whole area of research in like computer science and machine learning that sort of specializes in exactly this kind of problem, but it's designed for like, optimizing like uptime on a server or something like that. But we could take a lot of those models and I'm proposing, at least I'm thinking, you can take a lot of those models and apply them to these sorts of mate choice dynamics. But it's a non-trivial problem. And this is, a kind of recurrent theme in my research is putting together these simulations, right? It's mating feels very natural to us, right? It's what we were built to do in large part. And so we just do it without thinking about it. And it just seems very obvious how all of these things happen. But it's not until you like sit down and try to build a system that has to do these things that you realize all the problems that our minds are solving, like in the background, that we don't even realize that we're solving. And when you sit down and you have to program a thing that does that, right? All of these problems immediately become extremely clear. Like, oh God, how am I supposed to program this to get over this problem? And so all of my research has basically just been, me running into a problem I don't know how to solve and then throwing some stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Do you think there's a complexity of volume thing that happens with like how much civilization has expanded? Like, I mean, having unlimited options in theory, not actually unlimited options, but like that's got to complicate things, right?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I contributed to a paper that was spearheaded by a friend of mine, Carrie Getz, that was sort of meditating on this issue, right? That just the many ways in which our modern mating markets are just dramatically different from the kinds of markets that our ancestors would have experienced for 99% of human history. I mean, this is completely unprecedented. Just the sheer number of options that we have, and with things like dating apps and stuff on our phone now, right? Like we have unprecedented access to potential mates in our local environments, and how that interacts with our mating psychology, I think, is just a huge open question. I have no answer for you. And I also think anybody who claims to have an answer is probably lying to you.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, on the one hand, you might think, right, that our minds are aware of this, and so we sort of adjust our mating psychology, we adjust our mating behavior, to act in accordance with somebody who has unlimited options, right? Like, so we become, maybe more fickle, less patient, and have more wandering eyes, because that's the sort of economically rational thing to do when you've got lots of outside options. But on the other hand, this is completely unprecedented for our species, right? This is a huge evolutionary oddity, and there's it's very unlikely. Evolution is quite slow compared to the timeline of human history, so it's very unlikely that we have adaptations that are designed for reasoning about populations of the size that we live in. And so it's possible that from the perspective of our sort of very ancient psychology, right, it just still acts like we live in populations in the order of thousands, and we're just not caught up to the fact that we live in populations of billions. So it's not well known, I think, what's going on. Is our mind actually taking into account the size of our mating markets, or are we living in these giant mating markets but acting like we live in small ones? I don't know. Mm-hmm. It's a great question.
Yeah. I think a lot of people say that like social media kind of just exposes who we truly are to a certain extent, even though we put on a face at the same time. But it's interesting to think about how like men will portray themselves as like financially successful and having a bunch of resources on social media, like to get clout. And like, I feel like there is probably a bias that like women may try to really focus on physical appearance instead, and just how these kind of possible evolutionary traits like do show up like that. It's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was something that was even mentioned. It was either your UC video that you did, or David Buss's TED. Yeah, his TEDx in Vienna that he did, that was like talking about the same thing and how drastically different the sexual like preferences of like interactions between men and women were. They were just so drastic. It was kind of hilarious. That whole TEDx could have been a comedy bit, but yeah, like they say the exact same thing, is that there's a clear financial, it was, the 5 preferences that we've already kind of laid out, and I'd love to hear a little bit about more and up and coming ones that you're looking at. But the top 3 are really like human traits. Like that's like deep, like friendship, relationship, like they kind of go across the board. And then in the mating preferences, I think the ones that I keep coming back to, and obviously I'm not in the research, but is just that financial and resources and childbearing ability. You know what I mean? Like as a underlying for like attractiveness. And like, yeah, it's just so interesting how like he was saying social media, we talk a lot about how like, oh, like you should just be like understood for who you are or whatever. Like don't judge people like that. You don't want people talking about you like that. And yet a lot of people who say that will go straight to social media and try and portray that. So it's not even like somebody has to say it about them. They're doing it about themselves, just as like, maybe case in point for it being a very instinctual thing that people evolved to want to, show themselves to society like they are the people who are highly selectable. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, people are strongly incentivized to deceive. Yeah, right. Like, how am I going to be most successful in attracting a potential partner? Am I going to say, yeah, I drive a beat up old Camry, or am I going to say I drive a new BMW? Right. Obviously, if I, say I drive a brand new BMW, I'm going to be more successful. So like, what is my incentive to tell the truth then? Well, the fact that I'll eventually get figured out, but like, that comes later. There are ways of dealing with that too. So yeah, people are definitely incentivized to deceive in mate choice, which is, poses the sort of flip problem for perceivers, which is, related to what we were mentioning earlier, right? Like, how do you figure out what a person is really like, given that you have limited time and given that they're incentivized to lie to you? It's a not trivial problem. Although at the same time, this is like a constant back and forth in psychology, right? To what extent do people have sort of accurate self-knowledge, and to what extent do they portray themselves accurately? I mean, I don't know that we know, and this is a literature that can be a little bit all over the place, but the number that people like to claim at least is everybody does lie a little bit, right? Everybody makes themselves seem a little bit better than they actually are. Everybody makes themselves look 10% better than they actually are. But at the same time, if everybody is lying, then everybody's also telling the truth, right? If everybody is making themselves look, if everybody's claiming to be 2 inches taller than they actually are, then just take whatever they say and subtract 2 inches and you know the truth.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and maybe there isn't too much here, but I'm curious, like, about the differences between someone who is being like really cocky versus somebody who is very humble, and how people do choose humility. But I'm thinking like maybe that's just not something that they choose off the bat, but it's something that they can learn over time.
That's a good question. I don't know. And, this has been a weakness in my research for sure. Like, we sort of neglected these kinds of individual differences in favor of trying to better model the psychology as a whole. That's not because those individual differences don't exist, but just because we're starting from scratch and we haven't gotten there yet. But those things probably do matter, right? And my guess is different strategies work better for different kinds of scenarios, right? And especially, if you're just looking for, a one-night stand, you just want to like get in there and get out, then, lying is probably a pretty good strategy, right? Because they're not going to be around long enough to figure out that you weren't telling the truth, right? But if you're looking for a long-term committed partner, right, like they're going to find out. They're going to find out that you drive a beat-up Camry. So pretending that you don't is not a very sustainable strategy for the long term. So my guess is, different strategies probably work better for different kinds of contexts. And I would guess people are probably pretty good at knowing when to use what strategy. But I don't know. It's an empirical question.
Yeah. Do you kind of just where my mind was going talking about that too? Do you see any correlation, or have you looked, or anybody within the evolutionary psychology fields seen any correlation between like personality traits and temperaments and success failure with mate selection? Like, are there consistencies between like more narcissistic people that like they 50% success rate, but then like,
Yeah, it's a good question. So this is something that my advisor, David Buss, this is what he used to study a lot, actually. He was originally a personality psychologist, and a lot of his earlier work was on personality and relationships. So this is literature I should know better than I do. But I don't keep close tabs on the like personality and mating literature. I do know, there's a lot of stuff on sort of dark triad and mating psychology, where dark triad is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. I don't love a lot of that literature for various reasons, but I will say, I think for the most part, what they find is, I think pretty much there's a well-documented association between, I think this is true, maybe, fact check me, but dark triad traits and unrestricted sociosexuality, which is basically just like orientation towards uncommitted sexual relationships. So, narcissists, people high in Machiavellianism, I think tend to be more inclined towards shorter, less committed, more sexual relationships, maybe because, they can get away with it. You can get away with being a narcissist for the short term, but it's harder to get away with it on the long term. In terms of, other less negative or less stigmatized, maybe depending on your perspective, personality dimensions, I mean, I think there's pretty robust correlations between neuroticism and relationship success. So being neurotic is not very good for the health of your relationship. So, do your best to be less anxious, less emotionally reactive. I think agreeableness, tends to be associated with more relationship success. I don't know much about personality and mate choice per se, other than, people like people with good personalities, right? They like people who are extroverted and agreeable and conscientious and not very neurotic and open to experiences. That tends to be more attractive. My guess is that extroverted people probably do relatively well on the mating market because they're the ones who are motivated to get themselves out there and talk to lots of people and be the life of the party. But I don't know. I can't think off the top of my head of any research on like extroversion and mate choice success per se.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like just throughout your whole path and journey of doing this type of work, have there been any like key findings, or maybe like not even findings, but maybe some data that came back, what you weren't hypothesizing that was really poignant and stuck out to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so one is the stuff that I'm probably in some ways most known for. So like I said, a lot of my early research and continuing through now has been on trying to figure out, how do people estimate mate value, right? How do I decide how attracted I am to this person given all the things that I want in a partner? And there are, a handful of different models out there that people propose, but there wasn't much in the literature when I started doing this work, right? So my first step was just come up with as many different ways as I think are plausible that this could happen, either coming from the literature or just coming from my head. And the first thing that I thought would be true is I think the first thing that most people think or thought would be true, which is that it's basically going to be what's called like a weighted sum, right? So basically, let's say I'm thinking about physical attractiveness and intelligence, right? I have a preference for physical attractiveness. I have a preference for intelligence. Let's say I prefer physical attractiveness more than you do. Well, what does that mean in terms of how we make our decisions, right? I think the most common way that people think this works is that our preferences kind of act like weights in our evaluations. So if I prefer physical attractiveness more than you do, then what that means is, physical attractiveness makes up a larger part of my evaluations than it does of your evaluations, right? Physical attractiveness weighs more in my decisions than it does in your decisions. I honestly thought, I think that's the default assumption that most people make. And when I started doing this research, I was like, that's obviously correct. That's going to be the one that does the best. And then I came up with this other one that I was like, well, it could be maybe what I have is like in my head, I have an ideal image of a partner who is, such and such physically attractive and such intelligent. And what I do is every time I encounter a partner, I just compare them to that like prototypical ideal. And the closer they are to that ideal, the more attracted I'll be to them, right? And you can see how that's like, I know this is getting very abstract, but that's a little bit different from the weight approach I mentioned just a minute ago. And I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. Like that could be, I think that's probably wrong, but that's something that somebody could imagine is true. So I'll throw that in there, I'll test it, and I'll show that it's wrong, and then we'll move on. And then, I threw in some other ones too. And then I did the work, and it was just like this distance one, this like prototypical ideal that just blew the others out of the water. Like this is very clearly the much better model. And it's, continued to be the much better model across all the work that I've done. It's really like I've completely changed my belief on that one. I really thought the weighted sum was going to be the one that pulled ahead, but it's just consistently this sort of ideal prototype model that has been the one that keeps winning. As far as something else, it was sort of like a kind of key finding and or something surprising. This is what I'm pretty excited about lately. This is actually coming from a paper that just officially got published a couple days ago by coincidence, or yesterday actually by coincidence. So in order to do a lot of this work, it's pretty complicated, right? Because some of these mate choice models, they're complicated. They've got a lot of moving parts. It's not necessarily clear, how to derive predictions from them and how to test those predictions cleanly against human data. So a lot of the work that I've done over the last couple of years has been trying to develop an approach that can let us test these models more clearly. And the approach is basically this. We call it couple simulation. The idea is, and you might have seen me talk about this before, you go out into the world, you get people who've already made choices. So people who are already in a relationship, you measure things about those people that you think is relevant to their choices, and then you create little simulated copies of those people, inside your computer. And then you can run those little simulated copies of those people through simulated mating markets that work according to, whatever mate choice model you think is interesting. And you can see what mate choice models do the best job of pairing those little simulated copies of real world people back with their actual partners, right? The idea being, if I'm simulating mate choice correctly, if I understand how mate choice really works and I simulate it accurately in my computer, I should be able to take these little avatar agents and put them back together, right? They should make the same decisions that their real world counterparts did, and they should tend to form the same relationships again. If you think like the Black Mirror episode Hang the DJ, it's sort of like that. So we've been doing this work for a while now, and we have an initial paper where we show this method works in theory, and we show we can develop some models that do a relatively good job of, you can take real world couples, simulate them, break them up, and then run them through this mate choice model, and you can do a really good job of reproducing those original couples, like often reproducing somewhere in the neighborhood of 45% or more of those real world couples using these simulated models. So all of that is cool, but the thing that surprised me is this. So all of this was just designed to evaluate models of mate choice, was just to see, can we accurately pair people back together? But just by chance, we happened to also ask these people, like, how's it going, right? Like, are you satisfied in this relationship? Are you committed to your partner? Are you in love? Are you jealous? Like all these sort of standard relationship quality questions, just because we're like, we might want this for other projects. We'll see. So I said, we're able to reproduce somewhere in the neighborhood of about 45% of these real world couples, right? And then I got to thinking, like, well, okay, 45%, that's pretty good, but like, what's different between the 45% we're getting right and the 50% we're getting wrong? And one of my colleagues, she phrased this beautifully, I thought. She said, well, is it the model that is wrong, or is it the people that are wrong? And that was a question. Like, maybe these are just people that should not be in a relationship together, right? Maybe some of these people, just made bad mate choices. And so what we did is we looked at those relationship quality variables between the couples that we're simulating correctly and the couples that we're simulating incorrectly. And what we see is across the board, the couples that we are able to accurately reproduce in these simulations are just happier. They're more satisfied, they're more committed, they're more in love, they're more everything. And the couples that we're reproducing inaccurately are less happy. And that totally unpredicted, totally unexpected. And I still don't have a good explanation for it. I have no idea, what these models are picking up on that is explaining this difference in satisfaction and commitment between these couples. But we've replicated it like 5 or 6 times now. It seems to be a quite robust phenomenon that the couples that we are able to accurately simulate are just happier.
Is there a variable that sticks out? I know that you mentioned, like, are you jealous or something like that? Was there a question that was really present?
That's a good question. I mean, it seems to be just across the board, right? Which is, especially these dimensions do tend to be correlated with one another, right? If you're more satisfied, you tend to be less jealous. If you're more in love, you tend to be more satisfied. So they do all kind of hang together. But these are also, pretty distinct evaluations of the partners, but we see pretty much the same effect size across all these different dimensions. So it just seems to be a kind of across the board higher relationship quality, at least as far as we can tell. I initially thought it's something like, maybe the people that were accurately predicting, their partners just matched their preferences better, right? Maybe they're just like, they're getting better matches. It's not that. Then I was like, maybe the people that were matching, maybe they're just super desirable people, and super desirable people are happier in their relationships for some reason. It's not that. Maybe it's, the people that were matching inaccurately, they're the ones who have, lots of really good outside options, whereas the people that were matching correctly are the ones that don't have lots of good outside options. I still think that maybe has some truth to it, but as far as we can tell, it's not that. At least we haven't found the smoking gun evidence that's true. But, I'm unsure. It's a mystery, but it's an exciting mystery, right? I think it's cool that we have models that for some reason are able to identify happy couples, but it's perplexing that I don't know exactly what the models are doing to do that.
Yeah. This ideal prototype model, like while you were going through the weighted sum and then this ideal prototype, I was like, wow, I've definitely had like an ideal prototype my whole life. Yeah. And I've always compared somebody to that. And it's definitely how I chose my current partner. Like, it's so interesting how that is like so present in my mind, and it always has been. And yeah, I know there's the evolutionary impact, but yeah, I'm so curious about like the environmental impact that kind of formed what that image and prototype is. Yeah, so many layers.
Agreed. It's funny. It's interesting that I think it's interesting that you had that intuition, right? Because I think so many researchers, when they come at this, they're like, no, it's a weighted sum, or no, it's like a threshold thing. The ideal prototype is, I think, one of the least popular models, although it's, in my research at least, one of the ones that keeps coming out is performing relatively well. So it's interesting that that's your intuitive experience, and I'll take it as supportive for me.
Yeah, definitely.
But no, that I think that's this goes back to like my early interests, which I had long abandoned, but now I'm sort of coming back around to. Is I mean, I wouldn't contrast the evolutionary and environmental effects, right? Because whatever environmental effects there are on our preferences, right? Those environments have those effects because we evolved to respond to them in the way that we did, right? So it's evolution that makes those environmental effects possible. But those are still really important to understand, right? Like I think, okay, great, we know what people want when we ask them as, like adults, but like, where do those desires actually come from? Yeah, like what is the developmental trajectory of these preferences? And yeah, how does your prior experience on the mating market, your prior experience with relationships, your life experience in general, right? How does that intersect? How do all those things intersect to create your desires? We have very little answer to, and that is disappointing and alarming.
Something that I've been thinking about too, as we've been going through some of these preferences, is the idea of like, I don't know that I have a better word other than like selfishness, but like, how does this idea of like, I'm choosing this mate because I gain from this selection, how have you like seen any evidence that could be a driving force on selection, or has it been an area that needs more research? I'm sure, as many areas do, but
it's a good question. I mean, I think, I take a particular approach to thinking about mate choice that many people would call kind of maybe callous and sort of cold and economical. That, yeah, like people are sort of trying to optimize the utility that they get out of a particular mate selection. And there are a lot of people who, would prefer to think about mate choice in a more romantic way, that like, not everybody is constantly just sort of selfishly trying to maximize their own outcomes. And there are some people who are, selflessly interested in, I don't know, something else. I tend to think like, this is a useful explanatory framework for thinking about mate selection, right? No matter how you want to think about mate selection, right? You can always frame it as an optimization problem, right? You're always trying to optimize some quantity, and you're using some set of decision rules to try to do that. But that doesn't imply that that's what is actually happening inside the heads of the people when they're making these decisions, right? Like you're not, choosing your partner because you're sitting down and writing like, okay, what are the benefits they provide me in terms of this and in terms of that? No, you just like them, right? You enjoy their presence. You want good things for them. You want to be around them, and that motivates you to choose them. Now, why do you like the particular things that you like, right? Why do you enjoy the presence of the particular people that you enjoy the presence of? Well, it's because, your mind is designed to make these calculations in such a way as to maximize some kind of utility or something like that. But that's not to say that, people themselves are doing this selfishly. People are doing this, because it feels good to make other people feel good, right? So I think you should not mistake the sort of cold theoretical language with proposals that this is actually what's going on in people's heads when they're making these decisions. That said, I also think the way that I'm guilty of this as well, but I think the whole mating literature is also guilty of this. The way that we study human mate choice is very heavily dominated by this sort of Western industrialized mode of mate choice, which tends to be, very individualistic, very solipsistic, right? Like I go out into the world and I pick the partner that is best for me, and that is who I choose. And, that is, for the most part, how a lot of mate choice happens in the modern West, but that is not entirely true either. And that's probably not how mate choice has happened throughout most of history, in that, other people do play a huge role in shaping who you choose, right? Everybody knows like the meet the parents trope is a trope for a reason, right? Families have a huge impact on who we choose, and people do have to consider they have to balance their own desires against the desires of their families. Friends have a huge impact, right? Everybody has at least one story of a friend's spouse who they hated and maybe tried to nudge them away from, right? So the idea that it's just like you out in the wilderness sort of choosing the best partner that works for you with no consideration for others, I think it's a useful simplification for now, but it is a simplification, right? And we do have to get better at thinking about how people balance the needs of others in making their choices.
Is there any literature on like the successes of arranged marriages and like the success of those mating endeavors as compared to kind of like the Western way of doing things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think this is something that I think psychologists have really neglected. Psychologists are like so like just zeroed in on like the US, UK, and Australia. That's like 99.9% of psychological research, right? But people, I think in sociology and economics and anthropology, tend to be a little bit more broad-minded about these things. And so there is I think there is research out there on successful arranged marriages. And my understanding is that, basically they work. People wouldn't keep doing them around the world and across history if they didn't work. I mean, I think people find a way to be happy, pretty much whatever the circumstances of their choices were. But I don't know of a lot of like, clear psychological research comparing the mechanisms of arranged marriages versus love marriages. This is something that I have some anthropologist friends who have kind of collected some data on these things and sort of mused about these things, but I don't think anything's quite come to fruition yet.
If you were to just hypothesize or like theorize yourself, what you think could be leading to a success, maybe a higher than anticipated success rate in an arranged marriage, what would you maybe guess psychologically what's going on in that scenario?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, this is actually an area of some amount of debate. Different people, there's some differences of opinion on this. There's some people who believe that, to the extent that preferences matter in choice, they should also matter in relationships, right? So if my preferences are really dictating who I choose as a partner, then also once I'm in a relationship, right, if my partner doesn't match my preferences, then I should probably be unhappy with them, right? Because the whole point of preferences is to make me choose a good partner. I think that's probably wrong. I think, preferences function to make you choose a partner. And then once you choose a partner, right, it's a whole different game, right? You've got a whole different set of considerations now that are not necessarily relevant to who you'd ideally prefer to be with, right? Preferences might be involved in some way or another, but it's probably a relatively indirect route. Because, once you're in a partner, you have to consider, right, how good is this relationship for me, right? Is this working out? How, what's the likelihood that I could actually find another relationship that would be as good as this one, right? There's no point in leaving my partner because they're not as funny as I want them to be if they're the funniest person around, right? And you also have to consider, like, what are the costs of switching out of this relationship compared to the benefits I would get of another one, right? What am I going to lose? What's going to happen with my family? What's going to happen with their family? How are we going to divide up our friends, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, like the social stigma of a divorce, like putting pressure on somebody to not get
exactly.
it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And, I would guess, I don't know from firsthand experience, but I would guess in places where arranged marriages are more common, right? By definition, culturally, other people have more say in your mate choice than in places where love matches are more common, right? So, if there is greater success, I would imagine that it in part comes from greater consideration of, the costs to switching that come from your and their families, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. And so what are some of I know you've kind of touched on this as we've gone, but some of the future directions or future things that you look forward to doing in your research?
Yeah. What do we do? One big one, I don't want to promise too much on this because this is not, completely set in stone, but a lot of the research that we do, as you might have been able to figure out from the way I've been talking about things, involves basically looking at people who've already made their mate choices. mostly because methodologically that's way easier to do. But the constant problem when you're looking at people who are already in relationships is you always have a direction of causation issue, right? It's really hard to know, right? For example, did their preferences dictate their choice, or did their choice dictate their preferences, right? And I think the answer is probably both, right, to some degree. But it's hard to know for sure. And so a big direction that we want to move into is, now that we've developed this approach where we can, simulate real people inside simulated mating markets, I think that gives us a lot of power to start moving into the sort of prospective prediction territory where we can get single people, measure things about them while they're single, and then, follow them over the start of a relationship, or in fact, make relationship recommendations for them, right? We could say, this simulation says this person's a good match. Let's try it out and see how it goes. And so that's something we have planned for a couple of years in the future. We got a couple other projects we got to clear out of the way before we do that. But that's one future project that I'm really excited about doing. And I think, given that these models seem to have this power to predict relationship quality, I think if we can continue that even in the prospective territory, right? If we can not only recommend good matches for people, but recommend matches that actually turn out to be happy, then, that's theoretically quite cool, but it also has, potentially valuable practical implications. But no promises.
No promises, but look out, Match.com.
eHarmony.
Yeah, eHarmony.
We'll see.
That's cool.
If it works at 1% as well as it seems like it might, then I'll be over the moon.
Nice.
Yeah. And so you've gone through this doctoral program, getting a PhD. Everyone knows that it's a rigorous process. Like, thinking back about your experience, and for listeners who are possibly thinking about that route, do you have any bits of advice or things that you found particularly helpful throughout that journey?
This is like such a polarizing topic. Maybe I spend too much time on Twitter because I feel like if you read, academic Twitter, it's like 98% people complaining about how terrible grad school is and how terrible academia is. It can leave you with a very negative picture. And all of that's true. But I'll say I'm maybe in the minority in a sense of being, I loved grad school. Grad school was very hard, very exhausting, very precarious and uncertain time in my life, but I had so much fun. It's tough, right? If you want to go into academic psychology, if you want to get a PhD in psychology, you're going to spend minimum 5 years. So I'll say all the bad stuff first, right? Scare people away. You're going to spend minimum 5 years, often 6, 7, occasionally 8 years, right, in a PhD program, making ridiculously little money, just above starvation wages, especially depending on where you live, and working nonstop, right? Working really hard on really hard problems, right? You're going to take classes for a few years, maybe 2 or 3 years, and those classes are going to be very difficult, but also very fulfilling, but they're going to be very difficult. And then you're just going to be, set out to do science, which is, extremely difficult. You've got to come up with, new ideas that nobody has ever thought before. You've got to figure out ways of testing those ideas. You've got to actually run those experiments, and, hopefully you have a budget, but probably you don't. You've got to, analyze that data. You've got to, make sense of it. You've got to present that to your peers and your advisor, and you got to present it at conferences in front of strangers. You've got to write that up into a good manuscript. You've got to submit it to journals and get it rejected over and over again, and just get constant criticism from reviewers that are way too mean because they're anonymous. And then once you've done it, you've got to do it all over again, and you just got to do it over and over.
Lather, rinse, repeat.
Yeah. It's hard. It's really hard, just soul crushing work. And to be honest, the academic job market sucks. It especially sucks right now with the recent economic downturn, right? It's increasingly, I think it's increasingly impossible to get an academic job straight out of your PhD, I say as a person who did that. But so you're looking at probably several years of postdocing or visiting professor positions, which means moving around a lot, which is not easy. It's a hard life, and I need to be frank about that. But that said, like, I got paid for 5 years to just hang out, read papers that I thought were fascinating, talk with my friends about what I think are the most interesting ideas in the world, teach students who are, super excited. Well, mostly students who are bored and angry, but occasionally students who are like super excited about the same ideas I were, and to, just, think about the things in life that I think are most confusing and most interesting, and just try to figure out my best way to answer those questions. And I get to travel around to conferences. I get to go all around the world and visit cool different places, and meet all kinds of great friends, including Jamie Crumbs, who you had on the show before. It was just extremely intellectually fulfilling in a way that I don't think I personally could have got out of any other career. And I also just think I would not do well in any career but this one. I just am too stubborn to do well in any other career. So it was hard, and it was scary, and it was difficult, but I really genuinely loved it. And I, again, my job now has only gotten worse in so many other ways, but I also I love it. I have the absolute best job in the world. And so I think, my advice to you is grad school is going to suck. It is. And, I can't sugarcoat it. It's going to be extremely difficult work, and you're going to get paid way too little to do it. And so you should absolutely not go to grad school unless you cannot imagine yourself doing literally anything else, right? Unless you are, totally captivated by the work that you're doing, unless you just have a burning need to answer the questions that you're trying to answer, because that's what's going to make it good, right? That's what's going to make it fulfilling, and that's what's going to pull you through. So honestly, I would say I went through everything way too fast. I went, straight from undergrad into PhD and straight into a job, which is, convenient, has been convenient for my life. But I think a lot of people feel this need to rush through their education, but grad school is not going anywhere. Right? There are going to be PhD programs forever, and there's no age limit on when you can get accepted into a PhD program. So take your time. Again, it's hard. It's a hard process. And so you don't want to start down that path unless you're sure this is absolutely the path for you. So I would say, again, don't do it unless you can't do anything else. And the best way to figure out if you can do something else is try to do something else, right? Go, work a job outside of academia for a little while and see how it feels. You might enjoy it more than you expect. In which case, maybe grad school is not for you. Maybe you can just, have a real job and a real life. But if you work for a little while and just keep thinking, God, I really want to be doing the science, I really want to be answering these questions, then go to grad school and you'll be great.
Yeah. And so now I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
In some of our conversations with other professors who are doing a lot of research and have done a lot of research throughout their PhD program as well, they just really highlighted that role of mentorship. And now being a professor in a lab, being able to be a mentor to students and other colleagues, I guess, what has that journey been like for you? And how important do you think that role is?
Critical. The most important factor in my success, certainly, and I would wager the most important factor in most people's success is mentorship. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for a series of incredible mentors who honestly took a chance on me, despite maybe not being the most obvious candidate from the start, and who I think really nurtured me into being a better scientist. And so I owe a lot. I owe everything in my career and a lot in my life to the people who mentored me. And I try to pay that forward now. And I think it's that is without a doubt the most, or it's a very difficult aspect of my career. It's actually turned out to be far more difficult than I anticipated to be a good mentor, which has only further increased my appreciation for the good mentors I had in my life. But it's the most rewarding, also the most rewarding aspect of my career. I think it very few things in life feel better than, helping somebody find their passion, and also, teaching somebody to do something that they didn't think they could do, right? That is like, I just get such a rush out of doing that, which is why I probably push my mentees a little bit too hard and constantly try to make them do things that they can't do. But yeah, I think it is, in terms of advice to prospective graduate students too, like the fit between you and your mentor is by a huge margin the most important thing you should consider, right? Not where you're living, not even necessarily what you're researching, definitely not how much money they're going to pay you, because it's going to be pennies no matter what. But, it should be, can you have a good relationship with this person? Because if you and them, if you're on the same wavelength, if you're vibing together, like, you're going to have a great time. They're going to support you. You're going to learn a lot. Like, that is going to make the whole grad school process bearable. But if you and them don't get along, oh my God, like, I've seen that many times before, and it is a tragedy every single time. So, you definitely want to make sure you find, a good mentor who you really click with, because that is going to be the difference between success and failure.
I had another follow-up question based on something we were talking about earlier. You mentioned that the two primary areas of evolutionary psychology when it comes down to it are cooperation and mating and mate selection. So I'm curious, what's like a really fringe idea in the world of evolutionary psychology? What's like out there that's just like getting a little publicity? It's like, whoa, what are we talking about here?
Oh, good question. I mean, there's a wealth of fringe ideas, many of which do not deserve any amount of light or oxygen.
All right, which one would you give a little bit of light to as at least a hat tip to, keep doing that? There could be something there.
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah. What's the next big thing? I don't know. I mean, this is not a small thing by any means. This is something that has, thoroughly started to gain traction. But, one thing I can say that I've over the course of my short career that has like really been gaining in market share, and that I'm super happy to see gaining in market share so much, is development. There are so many more people who are really thinking seriously about evolution and development, right? How has evolution shaped the ways in which our minds and our behavior develop? And I think that's, that's something that for a long time, evolutionary psychologists were just sort of studying the adult phenotype, and we're just sort of like, you would think that people just like hatched out of an egg and were just like immediately like this. And there wasn't much consideration of like, how do you go from a single cell to this, incredibly complex human mind? And so I think I'm so excited to see a lot of people thinking really seriously about development, especially because it, informs everything else, right? It opens up so many questions that we didn't even know to ask, and it also, is pretty critical to answering a lot of questions.
Do you mean development? I'm sorry, just point of clarity. Do you mean development in the sense of like how we go from like sperm and egg to a fully functioning biological being, or how we like made the transition from one sub like Homo sapien, pre Homo sapien sapien to where we are now?
The former. Yeah. So okay. How do you go from a baby brain to an adult brain?
Yeah, for real.
And there's so much cool work in there showing, both like how sophisticated infant and child and adolescent psychology is, how incredibly capable very young children are at solving a lot of the problems that we think of as requiring, adult intelligence or something like that. And it just a lot of really interesting work that kind of exposes, some of the, at times kind of surprising forces that have been really important in shaping the human mind. So off the top of my head, my friend Annie Wirtz just gave a plenary at HBES, our major conference that just passed, talking about the role of plants in shaping shaping infant psychology, and all the really interesting adaptations children seem to have surrounding, learning about plants and behaving towards plants, which is something that, again, in our sort of Western industrialized environment, we don't necessarily think of because, we're hardly ever around plants unless we choose to be. But, throughout most of human evolutionary history, right, like knowledge of local plants would have been absolutely essential to surviving, right? Both knowing which ones are poison so you don't touch them and which ones are food so that you know what to eat, right? Like that would have been, a really important task for a child to learn. Like, what are the plants like in my local environment? It does appear that there are really sophisticated learning adaptations in young children for thinking about plants specifically. And that's like such a cool thing that, no one, we would never have thought of if we, stepped out of our adult heads and try to think about development. But there's lots of other work. And I think this is, the reason why this is kind of taking off is because I think developmental psychologists, there's a huge strain in developmental psychology that was already sort of evolutionary without being as explicit about it. Like, these ideas were already kind of baked into the foundation of developmental psychology. The fields just like didn't talk to one another, and now they're starting to. And I think it's a really exciting sort of growth for the field as a whole to be making these connections and to be breaking into these new areas. So I think, more and more thinking about development, I think that's going to become a bigger and bigger part of the program. Maybe take a little bit of the mating and cooperation pie and give that to the developmental people, and I'll be very happy.
Yeah, that's cool stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thinking about like Sigmund Freud, yeah, right. So I'm curious because in clinical psych, people have started to, I feel like, more so throw some respect on his name, but also still people are like, some of these ideas are just absolutely ridiculous. What does the field of evolutionary psychology feel like? Are they like, oh yeah, sexual desires, like this is it?
I think from a 10,000 foot view, if you look at Freud from like a 10,000 foot view, I think a lot of evolutionary psychologists would say, some impressive ideas, right? Like, it was definitely thinking in the right direction in some ways, especially compared to his peers, right? Thinking about, foregrounding mating as being an important motivation of human behavior, right? I think, good. Nice. That is an important, and many of us would argue, accurate appraisal, although, probably maybe he went a little bit too far. And also, thinking about the role of unconscious motivations, right? Thinking about acknowledging the fact that not all of our behavior comes from this sort of like, conscious, intentional, articulatable set of desires. There are some things that, just happen in the back of our minds that we don't have access to, but that are critical for explaining our behavior. I think that's something that all evolutionary psychologists would say is extremely important to understanding human behavior, and something that we owe in large part to Freud. That said, when you get down into the details, when you get down into the methodology, it's all ridiculous, right? But for those two things, right? Yeah, Freud deserves a little bit of credit, maybe.
Somebody had to throw it out at the beginning in some ridiculous manner, and then let the world refine what he's done.
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And that's how science works, right? The first articulation of any idea is always totally wrong, but you build on it. That's good.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks so much for today. It's been so cool to hear about your process of just like identifying this problem, going after it, being like, oh God, there's another problem. Let's keep going after it. And just the passion that you have for this work. It really shines through. And I thought this conversation was awesome. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks for letting me ramble so much about crazy ideas.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to see how your models that you're running, like these simulations on, continue to be refined. Cause I think that's going to be a really telling and quickly of like as technology gets better, you're going to have a greater capacity to implement like deeper and deeper and stronger models. So that's going to be cool to watch what you come up with. It's going to be exciting.
Thank you. Me too. Hopefully. I hope you're right.